Gambit becomes a Herald of Galactus, and this story was great. I loved this so much. So here's a cool thing, right? This story being called What If Galactus Transformed Gambit? The real question here is, when does Gambit come to Marvel Rivals? So this opens up with Gambit back on Earth, and it actually takes place during the events of the mutant massacre. Now, this is really, really cool. I know a lot of you guys are familiar with it, and we'll talk more about it once we get towards the end of the story because it kind of becomes a focal point. But Gambit's effectively wrecked by guilt over the death of all the Morlocks, save the one that he saved. But seemingly that one didn't survive because in one panel, Gambit's running with the Skrull, and in the next, he's by himself. But the fact is, right, even if she did survive, it was in essence his fault, right? He's the reason why it happened in the first place, at least why it went down the way that it did. But in this moment where he feels this immense level of guilt, he's suddenly snatched up by Galactus. And Galactus simply says, "Child of Earth, you've been chosen for a most unique task. I'm Galactus, yada, yada, yada. You've been called into my service." Now, here's the cool thing about this. Over the course of the story, Gambit's gonna do some crazy stuff with this newfound power that he gets. Does it make him as powerful as New Sun? I mean, I don't know, maybe, possibly. And if you don't know who that is, we'll also talk about him here in a little bit because New Sun was amazing. He was like the coolest character, the coolest version of Gambit that Marvel never did anything meaningful with, and it sucked because he was dope. But the thing about this is that, as is always the case when this goes down, that when Galactus shows up, one of the things you always notice is, with the exception of Reed Richards, he doesn't really ask any questions. He's just like, "You've been called into my service. You get the power cosmic. Go forth and do my bidding." Because Galactus isn't really used to being disobeyed in any meaningful way. The other cool thing here is Galactus presents himself as this giant version, which Galactus can change shape. He can do pretty much anything he wants to, but he always appears huge and imposing because why not? But what Gambit does is the same thing that so many heralds have done whenever they came into Galactus' service. There's actually two things he does. The first is he dons what is quite possibly the greatest Gambit drip that's ever existed in the history of Marvel Comics. This suit is fire. Like, he looks amazing. The next thing that happens is he immediately rebels against Galactus. Now, that doesn't happen all the time, right? It doesn't happen that fast all the time. Most every herald at some point turns on Galactus. And it's due to any number of factors, right? Silver Surfer did it, Terrax the Tamer did it, Firelord and Frankie Ray and all these guys, they've all turned on him at some point in time. But Gambit does it with a quickness. And the reason why is because the only thing he really cares about in the here and now is actually atoning for his actions during the mutant massacre. Now let's take a moment and kind of talk about this, right? Most of you guys are aware of the mutant massacre, even if you've only heard about it in passing. The idea behind that story is it was really like the first major X-Men crossover that we got. Technically it was Mutant Massacre, Fall of the Mutants, a few different things, but Fall of the Mutants was more a series of disconnected X-Men stories where Storm and Forge fought the adversary and all that kind of stuff, and it ends with the Siege Perilous. Doesn't really matter. What does matter here is that during Mutant Massacre, the villain Mr. Sinister had come to believe that the Morlocks that existed below the city of New York, down in the sewers, were either a byproduct of his experimentation or somehow tapped into his experimentation. But ultimately, he wanted to get rid of them. Originally, the team consisted of like Sabretooth and Chimera and Greycrow and a handful of others. But the way that the Mutant Massacre unfolded was that one group of the Marauders, or one part of the team, tracked a Morlock by the name of Tommy. You guys know her from X-Men the Animated Series. She was the mutant that was basically two-dimensional. She was flat and she could like go against walls and things like that, but she had rainbow hair. But Gambit's involvement in the Mutant Massacre came by way of leading the rest of the Marauders down another tunnel. And that's where the massacre took place. Now, we ended up finding out by way of the, I guess, quote-unquote newest launch of Gambit's origin. There have been several since it happened, but the old X-Men origin comics, that Gambit actually didn't control his powers or couldn't control his powers when they initially emerged. So he made a deal with Sinister, that Sinister would perform a partial lobotomy, giving Gambit control over his abilities, but reducing his power at the same time. But in order to do that, Sinister was like, "You will do a favor for me at some point in time." And that's when he called in the favor, was during the Mutant Massacre. And so ultimately Gambit was only able able to save one Marlock, which was Marrow. That's who it was. That's the girl at the beginning of this. It was Marrow. Ultimately, he saved her. But again, he was wrecked by guilt over what it was that he had done. And so that's kind of what you see here, right? Him just sort of racing back with the intention of basically destroying the Marauders and potentially using this newfound cosmic power that he has to try to find some way to potentially save the Morlocks or potentially even resurrect them, right? If he has that ability within his repertoire. Now, ultimately, of course, Galactus sends out his Punishers, basically these beings that are tasked with tracking down rogue heralds. And because they're empowered by Galactus, they are, by all standards of measurement, indestructible. Galactus does that from time to time. And high-level cosmic entities do that from time to time. Even like demonic beings, right? The mindless ones of Dormammu, for example. They all kind of serve this purpose where they kind of carry out the whims and wants of whoever it is that creates them or controls them. And so, of course, Gambit faces off against these things, and we get to see his display of power. It's really just Gambit's normal abilities as we've traditionally seen them, amped up on a cosmic level. But do not let the simplicity of that statement fool you, because there is a credible argument to be made here. He is as powerful as New Sun, if not more powerful, right? New Sun was a version of Gambit from an alternate reality that, if my memory serves me, and I'm not going to swear by this, I think he killed all the superheroes in his universe after accidentally like blowing up a whole world or something along those lines. But basically, he could like detonate matter the way that Gambit does, but he didn't have to throw cards. He didn't have to physically touch anything. Instead, he could just look at something and it would explode, right? It was really, really cool. He ended up traveling to Earth and things went sideways, and then Gambit undid his lobotomy, which I don't even know how you do that, and then in turn had it redone, which sounds even more crazy. But the fact is, right, New Sun was immensely powerful. When you look at someone like Gambit that has the ability to charge and detonate matter on effectively the atomic level, right, by manipulating its kinetic energy, that when you add the power cosmic to that, suddenly you have a guy who can literally detonate matter across the entirety of the universe. Now, I imagine there are limits here, most likely to his imagination, or maybe just the sheer amount of destruction that he can cause. And as always, with pretty much every herald that exists out there, he's weaker than Galactus. The only one that's the exception to that, I believe, is the Fallen One. But again, because of the fact that he's not really able to overtake these Punishers, essentially, Galactus shows up, right? And he tells him, I have made you my herald for a very particular reason. I need you to steal something for me, which is kind of a cool twist, to be honest, because whenever Galactus makes a new herald, he sends them out to find worlds. So I like this idea that, yes, Gambit's finding a world, which kind of taps into the traditional role that a herald plays, but he's doing something totally different with it, because the reality is that he's been sent to the home of Taneleer Tavan, right? The Collector, who's basically throwing this kind of great big huge soiree that's going on and everybody's attending and that kind of thing. That also happens out in the Marvel Universe. For those of you guys who have only seen the movies, yes, you have Nowhere, the giant celestial head that's a bar that everybody hangs out at, but there's all kinds of other places across the multiverse where people gather and socialize and do all kinds of different things, right? But when Gambit shows up here, he actually starts invoking his charm. And initially, he starts hitting on Hepzibah, which is weird, man, because Gambit has a thing for furries. Now, of course, she rejects him because she is with Cyclops' dad, right? So it's kind of like, look, Corsair's my man, I will see you when I see you. But then he meets the Collector. Now, one of the cool things about Taneleer is that as an elder of the universe, he's one of the oldest living beings in existence. And when you're that old, you develop all kinds of communication channels. So there's rarely anything that ever goes on in the Marvel Universe that Taneleer does not know about. It's why he's able to be so effective as the Collector, capturing these little relics of bygone ages, or these little trinkets, or even individual beings who have somehow survived the destruction of their race or something along those lines. It kind of answers the question of how he's always a step ahead and how he always gets there in time to basically capture those things. But he knows who Gambit is, and he knows why Gambit's here. But he's also very cavalier, right, about why Gambit's here. And a lot of that kind of goes into the hubris of Taneleer Tavan. The Collector is an incredibly arrogant being. Like, he just kind of looks at his age and he looks at his power and says, like, he alone is the only one that can really do what he does because of all the information that he has. He always has like a one-up on everybody, all those little things here and there, so very much caught up with himself. But Gambit, ever the charmer, actually ends up manipulating the assistant of Taneleer, and the two of them clearly are gonna touch naughty bits at some future point in time. I guess he doesn't love Rogue that much, and that basically leads to Gambit getting some very important information, because Gambit learns the nature of the Collector, and seemingly at this point in time, Gambit doesn't really know anything about the Collector, and because of that, it really kind of fits in well, because we get this sort of explanation, right? Worlds and empires live and die, often through no fault of their own, but when they're gone, who will remember them? That is the Collector's duty, his charge, to catalog, to protect, to keep what will inevitably become ruined. And that's why the Collector has all these things that are out there. Now, it's arguably a fate worse than death to be confined to one of the pods of Taneleer and just stay there, right, until you somehow die of old age, if it's even possible. Because if you're a being that is essentially immortal, or at least you don't age, well, then the question becomes, how long would you stay there? And you would probably be there for all eternity until the universe ends, because Taneleer will survive until the universe ends, unless someone of sufficient power destroys it. But Gambit realizes, okay, so like this guy has a kind of records that exist out there, right? A kind of catalog of all the stuff that he has. And so for us as the audience, is kind of looking at this and saying, okay, obviously the clearest thing for Gambit to do is to go find this Hall of Records and to access that information and then figure out where it is or what this artifact is that he's supposed to be stealing. Specifically, he's stealing an entire planet, which is kind of a mind-boggling concept when you think about it. But again, because of the fact that he's almost sort of toying with Taneleer, and then because he's tampering with them, at least he's just gonna like throw his cards into it and just say the heck with it, he's basically gonna destroy all the records. And that's when the Collector shows back up again. And it's like, look, you can't destroy my records. If you do, all the information will be lost for all eternity. I know what you're looking for. And honestly, you'll never find it. But the response of Gambit is like, I already figured out where it is, like where that planet is. But the reason why I was going through these records is because I just wanted to know why it was so important, why it means so much to you, and why it means so much to Galactus. And what Gambit ends up doing is actually pointing to all these little golden balls that exist within like the main foyer of Taneleer's whole area. And that's when he's like, that blue one, that's the planet. Right, that's what I'm here to steal. But then you get this really cool explanation, because Gambit's like, what's going on here? Why does this planet matter so much? And we get this awesome thing, because what the Collector says is, he says, long ago, Galactus was a mortal on the planet Ta, imperfect and normal. He escaped his dying universe, and in the Big Bang, he became what you know today, a power beyond comprehension. I never experienced Ta, but I couldn't help but wonder what that place was like. The world that birthed a god, the only world the Devourer of Worlds ever really cared for. The curiosity picked away at me. Now, the cool thing about this is that for years, we didn't know, right? I mean, like the origin of Galactus was covered in the old school Thor comics from Walter Simonson, but we never really knew anything about Galactus's world outside of the fact that he came from seemingly a world of science. One of the things that we learned from Al Ewing's run on Defenders Beyond is that when the multiverse dies and it comes back, right, there've been like several versions, the second multiverse, third one, fourth one, fifth one, sixth one. The sixth multiverse is the one that Galactus comes from. And whether it was the entire multiverse or his singular universe, we don't definitively know, but we do know that science was like the biggest thing. That's all anybody cared about. And when these universes or multiverses go through cycles, that's exactly what happens, right? A multiverse composed entirely of magic, a multiverse or universe that only cares about science. That's the one that Galactus comes from. So it is a cool bit of history, right? Because you actually learn about his mother Taya and all that kind of cool stuff. It was pretty dope. It was pretty fun. But what's really weird here is the Collector says, I commissioned the greatest worldsmiths to do the impossible, recreate a lost planet down to the smallest details. And so that's where Gambit's like, so you keep Galactus's old neighborhood hidden from him? That seems pretty petty. Now, what's weird about this, and the reason why I say it's so strange, is because the Collector basically rebuilt a world that he's never seen before. So how does he know how to rebuild it? How does he know what it looks like? Or if he's even remotely close to how it's supposed to appear. No one knows. There's no way he could know unless he somehow stole information from Galactus, which it's not really specified here, so I don't know, right? Your guess is as good as mine. But to the response of Gambit talking about how petty it is, the Collector says, is it? That's why you're here after all, because he wants it and he cannot have it. And that's where Gambit's like, I mean, they have a saying where I come from, right? Like everyone has a price. So what's your price for this? And that's where Collector says, no, I don't sell the things that I collect, right? Everything that I collect here is important to me. It's my sacred duty, right? To collect every artifact, one of everything that exists out there, because at some point it'll all be gone. And this is how it gets remembered. He's also just, arrogant and sadist. But the fact is, he's like, your power does not intimidate me. You make a move and I'll destroy the planet and everyone here in an instant. And so Gambit calls his bluff and he's like, all right, let's see if you'll actually do it or not. And so Gambit literally just like detonates all this kinetic energy that exists out there. And it just like throws Tannelier off. And that's when Gambit tells him, like, my power's kinetic. Did you not figure that out? Right? Like, surely you would have figured that out by now. And he's like, all I had to do was tap a few pulses through your fancy space station step by step. Easy to find out what's working and what's not. Lots of moving pieces in a big ship like this. So literally, as he was walking through it, he was charging things with kinetic energy. Now, again, this points to the idea that Gambit has the ability to charge kinetic energy in an object that he doesn't touch and actually keep it there. Now, Gambit being able to charge an object and then keep that object charged for a period of time, that's not new. He's done that before in Marvel Comics, right? Sit down a playing card and just kind of let it charge until somebody comes along and picks it up, and then it detonates, right? That's not a very new concept. But the idea of being able to do that on a cosmic level, again, this is all new, uncharted territory here. And so he says, charging up vaults, speeding up the kinetic energy of the locks, slowing down the speed of others, blowing up, and I mean all of your defenses, freed your captives that way too. So again, Gambit is able to not only manipulate kinetic energy, but actually pull it off of people so he can stop people dead in their tracks. And there's no limit seemingly to the power that he can manipulate here because the Collector goes to attack him. And the Collector is an immensely powerful being. I mean, in the cosmic hierarchy of Marvel, he's by no means anywhere near someone like Thanos in a pissed off state, or like any of the cosmic entities. But could the Collector kill all the superheroes on Earth minus the reality warpers or high-level telepaths? Probably, and I imagine he could give the high-level telepaths a run for their money. Now, that's headcanon, and I'm sure somebody who does power scaling could find a way to cook the books in whatever favor or whatever side they choose to win in that little scuffle. But the fact is, right, that he stops the Collector dead in his tracks, and I mean like halted. The Collector cannot move at all. He's just 100% potential energy. And that's when Galactus shows up. Right now, the cool thing about this is Gambit's like, okay, I kind of have an ace up my sleeve, man, right? I'm a man of poker, and they always say never bet against the house, but I've got a winning hand. And so what he does is he tells Galactus, this planet, right, that the Collector recreated, it's not something where like your long lost race resides here and you can somehow go back home again. This is a dead planet, right? I mean, there's just, I guess mountains or whatever the case happens to be, but like there's nothing living here. So there's no reason for this planet to exist at all. And at that point, Galactus takes it as an affront for a couple reasons. The first is because to meddle in the ongoings of Galactus by recreating his home world or something along those lines, it's a terrible thing to do, right? It's something that just pisses him off to no end because very few people are supposed to actually even know his origin story. But the second reason why it angers him is because it's almost like the Collector was dangling it in front of him and teasing him with it, right? Like, look at this home that you could go back to, but you can't because there's no way to go home and nothing's alive on this world. And so ultimately Galactus lashes out. Now, he doesn't like destroy everything in existence or anything along those lines. Instead, what he does is he confines the Collector to his own worst nightmare and says, from now until the ending of time, right, forevermore, you will be confined to this planet. You will never be able to leave, and you will be collected by me, the first in my collection of things that I will start to attain. So literally, the Collector's forced to exist in his own prison. And so Gambit in response to this, tells Galactus, I understand your desire to go back home. The difference between you and I, though, is I have the ability to go back home, and I know you don't, but surely in understanding the pain of the inability to return, you would grant me the ability to do so. You would let me go back home. And Galactus does, right? He was like, you have served me well, you are free. And Gambit is allowed to keep his power. And so in turn, he races back to Earth in one of the coolest depictions ever, and just like arrives back on the planet, presumably using his newfound power cosmic to go to war against the Marauders, destroy all of them to atone for his past misdeeds. And then who knows what he does after that. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. I told you guys it was really, really cool. It was a really fun story. It reminded me for some reason of like the old Jim Lee art style from the 1990s. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.